The year was 1860, and the air across America trembled with unease. In the North, factories roared and cities grew taller than church steeples, while in the South, cotton was king and the plantations stretched farther than the eye could see. But beneath the hum of progress and prosperity lay something darker, a moral wound that had never healed. Slavery. For decades, politicians had tried to balance it, bargain it, and bury it beneath compromise. Yet by the winter of 1860, the nation was no longer whispering about the problem. It was shouting. Men argued in taverns, newspapers screamed headlines, and families found themselves divided at their own tables. In Washington, senators pounded their fists on desks, warning of a house divided. And when Abraham Lincoln, a tall, gaunt lawyer from Illinois, was elected president that November, the fragile thread holding the Union together finally snapped. To the South, Lincoln's victory was not just an election, it was a threat, a sign that their world, their way of life, was being erased. By December, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed, one after another, like dominoes falling. The stars on the American flag were dimming, one by one. Across the land, people began to whisper the word that had haunted the Republic since its birth: war. In the cold dawn of March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office as the 16th President of the United States. The Capitol dome was still unfinished, a symbol, perhaps, of the unfinished promise of the nation itself. He stood before the divided crowd, his tall frame steady, his voice calm but firm. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "We must not be enemies." His words were meant to heal, but the wound was already deep. Lincoln knew the weight of the moment. He had never been a soldier nor a rich man. He was a man of books and belief in a union that could not be torn apart. Yet even as he spoke, Southern delegates were forming their own government in Montgomery, Alabama. They called it the Confederate States of America, and they had chosen Jefferson Davis, a stern, gray-eyed former U.S. Senator, as their president. Two nations now stood where one had been. As Lincoln returned to the White House that evening, he felt the burden of history settle upon his shoulders. Letters flooded his desk, some pleading for peace, others calling for war. But one message echoed above them all: the Union soldiers at Fort Sumter, in Charleston Harbor, were running out of supplies. And Charleston was in Confederate hands. The first test of Lincoln's presidency had arrived, a test that would ignite the bloodiest conflict in American history. April 12, 1861, dawn broke over Charleston Harbor with a red sky that glowed like fire. Inside the walls of Fort Sumter, Major Robert Anderson and his small garrison of Union soldiers prepared for the inevitable. Across the water, Confederate guns were aimed and ready. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, as the church bells of Charleston tolled, the first cannon roared. A shell arced through the gray morning sky and exploded above the fort. The Civil War had begun. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. Smoke, fire, and thunder shook the sea walls. Anderson's men fought bravely, but their ammunition ran low, and their flag was torn and blackened. Finally, they surrendered, the first Union defeat of the war, though not a single life had yet been lost in battle. But across the nation, hearts ignited like powder. In the North, men lined up at recruitment offices, shouting "Save the Union." In the South, crowds cheered, church bells rang, and people waved the new Confederate flag with pride. The storm had broken, and it would not end until more than 600,000 Americans lay dead. The war that many thought would end in weeks had turned into a furnace that devoured months and men alike. By the spring of 1862, the fields of Virginia, Tennessee, and the Mississippi Valley were soaked with blood. The North had the factories, the ships, the railroads, but the South had something harder to measure: fire in the heart. Men fought for the Union, men fought for their homes, and both bled on the same soil. Every dawn began with drums and ended with silence broken by cries from the wounded. The smell of gunpowder hung over river valleys and cornfields. Mothers wrote letters to sons they would never see again. And in Washington, Lincoln watched reports of battles, names that would soon become etched in American memory: Shiloh, Seven Pines, Second Bull Run. Each victory came with a cost so high it almost felt like defeat. In April 1862, on the banks of the Tennessee River, two massive armies collided near a small log church named Shiloh. For 2 days, thunder rolled across the hills not from storms, but from cannons. The Union Army under General Ulysses S. Grant was caught off guard. Confederate soldiers surged through the misty woods, their gray uniforms blending with the smoke, their cries echoing through the trees. By nightfall, the ground was carpeted with the dead. Rain poured down, turning the field into rivers of mud and blood. Grant stood under a tree, drenched and silent. One of his officers said, "It's been a terrible day." Grant's reply was quiet but cold as steel, "Yes. Lick 'em tomorrow though." At dawn, the Union struck back. When the guns finally fell silent, over 23,000 men lay dead or wounded. The scale of horror stunned both North and South. Shiloh had shown America that this was no gentleman's war, it was slaughter. While Grant fought in the West, another drama unfolded near the heart of the Confederacy. In Virginia, General Robert E. Lee emerged, calm, dignified, with gray eyes that revealed nothing but resolve. He took command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia and turned defense into art. Against him stood the Union's grand armies, larger, richer, but crippled by hesitation and pride. The Peninsula Campaign, the 7 Days Battles, and the Second Battle of Bull Run saw Lee drive back superior forces again and again. His men marched barefoot, half-starved, yet they cheered his name as if he were a prophet. To the south, Lee became the embodiment of honor and brilliance. To the north, he became the storm that would not break. Lincoln grew desperate for a general who could match him. He found one, a man quiet, relentless, and unforgiving, Ulysses S. Grant. September 17, 1862. Near Sharpsburg, Maryland, the Union and Confederate armies met along Antietam Creek and the earth itself seemed to shatter. It was the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 22,000 casualties fell in 12 hours of fighting. The cornfield, the sunken road, and the Burnside Bridge became names whispered like prayers and curses. When night fell, both sides still held their lines, too broken to fight further. But the South's invasion of the North had been stopped. The Union called it a victory, the soldiers called it a nightmare. Bodies lay in rows like fallen wheat. The photographer Matthew Brady would later display his images of the dead in New York, and for the first time, civilians saw what war truly meant. Lincoln looked upon the reports from Antietam and made his decision. The time for compromise was over. The war would no longer be only about preserving the Union, it would be about freedom itself. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln's pen trembled slightly as he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. With that stroke, he declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. It was a moral thunderbolt. The document did not end slavery instantly, but it changed the soul of the war. The Union now fought not just to reunite the nation, but to end human bondage. To the South, it was seen as an act of destruction. To enslaved people, it was a light breaking through centuries of darkness. Thousands fled plantations to join the Union Army or serve as scouts and guides. The war had become a revolution of meaning. Lincoln later said, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act." The winter of 1863 was bitter and uncertain. The Union had won moral ground, but the South still held its strength. At Fredericksburg, thousands of Union soldiers fell in futile charges up a stone wall. At Chancellorsville, Lee's army achieved its most brilliant victory, though it cost him dearly. His right hand, General Stonewall Jackson, was mortally wounded by friendly fire. When Jackson died, Lee whispered, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." The Confederacy mourned, but still believed. In the North, morale faltered. Critics called for peace, newspapers attacked Lincoln. Yet he refused to yield. "We shall nobly save, or meanly lose, the last best hope of earth," he said. Then came Gettysburg, July 1 to 3, 1863. For 3 days, Pennsylvania became the center of the world. Over 150,000 men clashed in fields and hills under a burning summer sun. The fighting was brutal and close. The sound of cannon echoed for miles. On the third day, Lee ordered Pickett's charge, a desperate assault across open ground. The Confederate soldiers advanced in perfect lines under a storm of shot and shell, but they never reached the Union wall. When the smoke cleared, thousands lay dead. Lee's army retreated, never again to invade the North. The war had turned. Farther west, Grant laid siege to Vicksburg, the fortress city on the Mississippi. 4 weeks, his men fought hunger, disease, and heat until the city finally surrendered on July 4, 1863, the same week as Gettysburg. The Mississippi River now flowed free from north to south, splitting the Confederacy in two. The Union had gained both ground and momentum. Lincoln, upon hearing the twin victories, simply said, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." Victory came at a terrible price. The hospitals overflowed with broken bodies and shattered souls. Fields that once grew corn now grew crosses. Letters arrived daily at homes wrapped in black ribbon. In both North and South, the war no longer seemed glorious, it was grief wearing a soldier's coat. Yet even in sorrow, there was faith. Nurses like Clara Barton tended to the wounded with tireless devotion. Poets, preachers, and mothers reminded the people that sacrifice meant something, that through fire, a new nation might yet be born. In November 1863, amid the graves of Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln stood to dedicate a cemetery. His speech lasted barely 2 minutes, but it would echo forever. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He ended simply, "That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." The crowd was silent. Some newspapers mocked the brevity of the speech. But history would remember it as the moment Lincoln gave words to the very soul of the Union. Winter came again, harsh and cold. Armies dug into trenches and prayed for spring. Supplies ran low. The Confederacy, strangled by blockades, starved while the North strained under the weight of taxes and sorrow. But in the White House, Lincoln found new strength in the quiet hours of the night. He walked the halls, reading letters from soldiers and mothers alike. "This nation shall have a new birth of freedom," he whispered to himself, over and over. As 1863 ended, the nation stood poised between ruin and rebirth. The South still fought fiercely, the North grew weary but determined. And somewhere in the West, General Grant, the man who never retreated, was preparing for his final march eastward. The fire of war had not burned out. It was only gathering strength for the last and fiercest year to come. By the start of 1864, America had become a nation of graves and ghosts. Both North and South were exhausted, yet neither could stop. The land itself seemed to bleed, every field a battlefield, every home touched by loss. In the White House, Lincoln's eyes grew darker with the weight of 4 years of letters, deaths, and decisions. He had become a man carved by sorrow, yet still held together by hope. In the South, the once proud Confederacy trembled beneath the crushing strain. Its men were barefoot, its railroads torn apart, its cities starved. Yet its heart, the will to resist, still beat. Lincoln knew that to end this nightmare, he needed one thing: a commander who would not stop until the job was done. He chose Ulysses S. Grant, the quiet man from the West who fought without boasting and won without mercy. When Grant came to Washington, Lincoln greeted him simply, "I can't spare this man, he fights." Grant's strategy was simple and brutal: grind them down. Unlike other generals, he did not retreat after losses. In the spring of 1864, he began a campaign that would push Robert E. Lee's army to its limits. From the Wilderness to Spotsylvania to Cold Harbor, the forests of Virginia burned with gunfire and screams. Every step forward cost thousands of lives. Soldiers wrote home describing trees shredded by bullets, the earth itself turned to fire. Yet Grant pressed on, saying grimly, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." To the people of the North, Grant seemed cold, a butcher, some called him. But Lincoln understood his purpose. "He fights," the president said softly, "and he means to end it." Far to the south, another Union general carried out a different kind of war, William Tecumseh Sherman. He was fierce, clever, and utterly unyielding. His target was Atlanta, the beating heart of the Confederacy's industry. Through the mountains of Georgia, Sherman's army moved like a storm. They burned railroads, tore down bridges, and destroyed anything that could feed the enemy's strength. The campaign was long, brutal, and merciless. Civilians fled as cities turned to ash. When Sherman finally entered Atlanta in September 1864, he sent a message to Lincoln, "Atlanta is ours, and fairly won." The news electrified the North and helped secure Lincoln's re-election that November. Lincoln's victory at the polls was not one of celebration, but of solemn duty. As he raised his hand once more to take the oath of office in March 1865, he did not speak of triumph, he spoke of forgiveness. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. His words floated over a crowd that had lost too much to cheer. He dreamed not of punishment, but of peace, a peace that would heal the shattered Union. Yet even as he spoke, Lee's army was surrounded, and the Confederacy's days were numbered. In early April 1865, Grant's army broke through the Confederate lines at Petersburg. Lee had no choice but to abandon Richmond, the capital of the South. Fires consumed the city as the Confederates fled. When Union troops entered, they found a ghost town, buildings smoldering, flags torn, families hiding in silence. Lincoln arrived soon after, walking through the streets with no guards, no ceremony. Freed slaves ran to him crying, "Father Abraham." Some knelt before him, but he gently said, "Do not kneel to me, you must kneel only to God." For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the war's long shadow was lifting. On April 9, 1865, in a quiet farmhouse at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, the two great generals finally met. Lee arrived dressed in full uniform, polished sword, spotless gloves. Grant came in mud-stained clothes, weary from the march. There was no hatred between them, only exhaustion and dignity. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could return home with their horses and would not be punished if they laid down arms. Lee accepted. The war, at last, was over. Outside, as word spread through the camps, soldiers on both sides stood in silence. Some wept. Others simply sat down and stared into the spring sky. After 4 years and over 600,000 dead, America's greatest war had ended not with cheers, but with quiet relief. The soldiers returned home to a country that no longer felt the same. Farms lay in ruins, cities burned, and graves filled the hills. Yet amid the ruins, there was something new, the dream of a United States reborn in freedom. In the South, freed men and women began to taste liberty for the first time. In the North, veterans limped home, carrying memories they would never speak of. The nation had survived, but it was scarred. And Lincoln, always humble, refused to call himself a victor. "I claim not to have controlled events," he said quietly. "Events have controlled me." On the evening of April 14, 1865, Washington was alive with celebration. The war was over. The Union preserved. The president, weary but content, decided to relax for the first time in years. He attended a play at Ford's Theater with his wife, Mary. As he entered the balcony, the crowd rose to its feet. The band played Hail to the Chief. For a brief moment, Abraham Lincoln smiled, that rare, gentle smile of a man who had carried too much for too long. He sat down beside his wife, unaware that just behind him, in the shadows, death had followed. At 10:15 p.m., actor John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, slipped into the presidential box. He raised a small pistol and fired one shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The laughter in the theater turned to screams. The president slumped forward, motionless. Soldiers rushed in, but it was too late. Lincoln was carried across the street to a small boarding house, where he lay unconscious through the night. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, the man who had saved the Union took his last breath. Secretary of War Stanton stood at his side and whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." When the news spread, the country fell into silence. Church bells tolled across the land. In every town, flags were lowered to half-mast. Even those who had once hated Lincoln now bowed their heads. The South had lost its war, the North had lost its heart. His funeral train carried him from Washington to Illinois, through cities lined with weeping crowds. Flowers covered the tracks. Children sang hymns as the black-draped locomotive passed. America had lost not just a president, but its conscience. The Civil War ended slavery but left deep scars that would last generations. Reconstruction began, an effort to rebuild the South and reunite the people. Freed men sought to learn, to vote, to live as citizens. But hatred and prejudice lingered. The dream of equality would not come easily. Still, Lincoln's vision, a united nation, free and indivisible, endured. The Union had survived the fire. And though its heart was broken, it still beat. The guns fell silent, the soldiers went home, and from the ashes of war, a new nation rose, one tempered by pain, strengthened by sacrifice, and bound together by the blood of its own sons. The Civil War had ended the old America and forged a new one, imperfect, but alive with hope. The words Lincoln once spoke still echoed through the land.